Greetings, I'm Michael Quinn Patton. This video is about the power of mental models. I'll be using, to illustrate that power, the evidence accumulated by Lisbeth Schorr about child poverty and direct cash transfers to families in poverty. She has pulled together in a blog published June 21st, 2022, the evidence about the effectiveness of direct cash transfers for positive child outcomes. In an earlier video, I reviewed that evidence and directed those of you who are watching this to read the full blog, which is also important to do. In this video, I'm going to take a systems approach to using what Elizabeth put together as a way of thinking about how we make the transition from the existing system to a transformed system that actually addresses poverty based upon the evidence. That hard evidence, communicated in Lisbeth Schorr's blog, she says, "We are dealing with interventions about which the researchers have provided solid proof of what works. Now there is relevant evidence, hard evidence on a crucial point, how family income support can change outcomes for children growing up in poverty." We now know how to end child poverty. That's her overall conclusion, based upon a very careful reading and synthesis of the evidence. But in December of 2021, Congress ended those direct cash payments. By failing to extend the direct cash payments, nearly 10 million children have slipped back below the poverty line. So what's happening? Why has the direct cash option been allowed to languish? This is where mental models and narrative comes in. Lisbeth Schorr has identified some of those mental model challenges. We're going to apply them in a systems framework to look at how they run through the narrative that becomes a barrier to acting upon the data. Resistance to promising solutions. The most entrenched resistance, she writes, to establishing a children's income floor is now, and always has been, the belief that no one should get something for nothing. Well, if we use the Water of Systems Change framework done by John Kania, Mark Kramer, and Peter Senge, published in June of 2018, they look at how mental models, at the bottom, is the foundation for changes in relationships and connections, power dynamics, policies, practices, and resource flows. So what I'm going to do is run the narrative through those various conditions using the analysis and synthesis done by Lisbeth Schorr. She was involved in the Office of Economic Opportunity during the War on Poverty days and recalls that President Johnson, in the 1960s, when he announced the War on Poverty, was adamantly opposed to making payments to poor people. It was programs, not cash, that would end poverty, he believed. He told Bill Moyers, his closest aide, "You tell Shriver, who directed the programs, no doles." She goes on to say he instructed economist Lester Thurow to remove from the economic report of the president, quote, "anything that could be construed as putting cash in the hands of poor people." What they preferred were behavioral solutions, cultural solutions. She writes, "The line of thinking that preferred behavioral solutions over economic supports was also a good fit with the popular sentiment that a significant part of the problem that needed fixing lay in the behavior of minorities. The predominant theory of the 60s, that the problems of the poor could be solved by programs aimed at changing individual behavior rather than by changing structures and providing income support. This dominant theory had deep roots and held sway for several more decades. Other developing countries were changing their thinking and policies, but the United States wasn't budging. It took the pandemic to generate direct economic cash payments to poor families. And then in December of 2021, that policy was ended. Ron Haskins, who ultimately became a senior advisor for welfare policy to President George W. Bush and the primary engineer of President Clinton's welfare reform, declared that mounting an effective war against poverty required, quote, changes in the personal decisions of more young Americans to get more education, work more, and stop having babies outside marriage. These are behavioral and cultural changes. So most systems theorists agree that mental models are foundational drivers of activity in any system. That's the headline of the Water of Systems publication. Mental models and social narrative work in a bidirectional way. Narratives are shaped by mental models, but narratives also over time shape the mental models we have. So in that interaction, we find this dominant anti-cash narrative enduring. Senator Joe Manchin explained his opposition to continuing direct transfers beyond the pandemic by asserting that he did not want to see our society turned into, quote, an entitlement society, close quote. Lisbeth Schorr writes, this meant making sure that financial support for families with young children would be constrained with both work requirements and income ceilings. Despite evidence to the contrary, he insisted that giving money to poor people who weren't working encouraged them to remain unemployed or leave jobs they already had. She goes on, quoting Senator Michael Bennet, I've shown him, Joe Manchin, the evidence that countries with higher childhood allowances have higher workforce participation rates than our own country, but I've not persuaded him. Another related dominant narrative, mental model, is getting something for nothing. The belief that no one, especially no poor people, should get something for nothing is deeply embedded in convictions about who deserves government help. Evidence that well-designed government help can make all lives better has not been universally persuasive. Wide-ranging surveys suggest that many legislators and large numbers of ordinary Americans are skeptical of programs that provide cash without conditions, except the case of the aged, of course, hence no work requirement attached to Social Security and Medicare. So let's use the Water of Systems Change framework and look at the narratives in these 6 conditions with mental models itself as the foundation. Begin with the overarching mental model as described by Lisbeth Schorr in her blog. The baseline narrative is that the poor won't spend money on basic needs if they receive money, that behaviors and culture are the real problem. There's fear of an entitlement culture. Old people get cash, but not children. A cynicism about whether anything works that Lisbeth Schorr has devoted her life to countering, and her work demonstrates that many anti-poverty programs work, but they don't work across the board and don't work to change the system. Or the allegation that there's insufficient evidence to know what to do. A systems transformation narrative, based upon what Lisbeth Schorr has reported, is that poverty is about not having money. And so making cash transfers to alleviate poverty makes sense. It's the most direct intervention one could have. The overarching fear that children hungry and growing up in poverty conditions will have a variety of negative outcomes. Thus, getting children out of poverty affects all other child outcomes. And the evidence is hard evidence that cash transfers work. So we see how contrasting narratives lead to different policies, practices, resource flows, and that's what we're going to look at. Changing mental models, they write in the Water of Systems Change, often means challenging power structures that have defined influence and shaped those models historically and in the present. So as we look at what those are, we look at the relationships and connections dimension. The baseline narrative is poverty treated as a cultural issue, with a focus on behavioral and cultural issues as levers of change. Poor people are viewed as irresponsible, unwilling to work hard, and poor because they've made poor choices. A systems narrative transformation, in contrast, views poverty as a systems issue, economic, social, and political systems. So the challenge is to eliminate barriers, create opportunities, support poor people to decide how best to use cash to meet basic needs, treat poverty as a systems issue, and the narrative is that poor people will do what's best for their children. Poverty connects to and affects a range of child development outcomes. In the power dynamics arena, under the baseline narrative of programs, government sets and controls program requirements. That's one-way accountability. In the systems transformation narrative, recipients control how funds are spent, but there's mutual accountability between the recipients and those who provide them with the benefits. The government has responsibility and accountability for providing adequate resources, and those who receive the resources have responsibility and accountability to demonstrate that they've used those resources to take care of their children. Which brings us to resource flows. In the baseline existing narrative, money flows to programs, educated program staff, mostly white or major beneficiaries. They're inadequate resources to really eliminate poverty, and it's a charity perspective. It's giving something to people, motivated by helping, but not viewed as fundamentally a responsibility and a right. In the systems transformation narrative, money flows directly to poor families, poor communities benefit, there's a responsibility to ensure adequate resources, and instead of a charity perspective, it becomes an investment perspective, investing in the future of children, future of communities, and the future of the country. When we look at practices, the baseline narrative of program work has created a huge program infrastructure with constraints on poor people. There's poverty stigmatizing that's a part of those programs. In the systems transformation narrative, getting money directly to the poor creates a system for auditable cash transfers, and that financial investing is empowering, not stigmatizing. Which brings us finally to policies. The baseline narrative around policies is to support programs, no dole, no direct cash payments, meaning that the emphasis is on ameliorating the effects of poverty. In contrast to the systems transformation narrative is to eliminate poverty, not just to ameliorate the effects. That means changing the system through supporting direct cash payments. So that is a way of taking Lisbeth Schorr's enormously significant and insightful synthesis of the research, concluding we now know how to end poverty, and the use of the mental models that she identifies as barriers to acting upon that evidence to look at the multiple pathways of change that are needed to actually transform the system. It means changing the mental models, including using the evidence to change those models, which leads to change interconnections, leads to different resource flows, different practices, different policies, and ultimately changed power dynamics. With that as a basis, it lets us see how to take data, run it through a systems framework to arrive at a theory of transformation based upon multiple pathways of change. And these multiple pathways would involve different players acting within their own realms of expertise and influence to ultimately change and shift the systems. Systems change is about shifting the conditions that are holding the problem in place. And the current mental models and narratives are fundamental to holding the current system in place. An inspiration for using evidence to take on this transformational challenge is what Lisbeth Schorr's insightful and important synthesis provides us.